I'm here to talk with you all about queer gazes, spectatorship, sensibility, and authorship in the horror genre. Okay, that's a mouthful. And I alone could give a talk on just like one of these things for about 4 hours. But the thing where this talk really came from is it came from me wanting to do a history of queer horror overall. And like most histories in film history, it starts with the Production Code of America written in 1934 of the United States, to be specific. And why it starts here is because in 1915 in the United States, there was this Supreme Court decision that said cinema could not be covered under the First Amendment. Now, back in the 1910s, there was still not a lot of feature-length films. You know, the technology wasn't there yet. But into the 20s and growing into the 30s, technology had evolved, and not only had technology evolved, the concept of Hollywood, the glitz, the glamour, the studio system had begun to gain root in the 20s. And as a result, there were a lot of scandals coming out of Hollywood. You know, of course, like always, the queers were leading the charge, but we had, you know, murders and rapes. And right during this time, there was a very conservative administration in America, particularly including a man called William Hayes. And so William Hayes was BFFs with a lot of the conservative religious groups of America. And they saw this cultural phenomenon that Hollywood and cinema was becoming. And they were like, wait, we need to like slow it down a little bit here. And this is where the production code comes from. Now, the interesting thing about the production code, which I have a bit of an excerpt up here, you can read some of it, is that it was written in 1929, but it was not enacted until 1934. So there's this 5-year period. And I'm a teacher back in the DC area, and I always teach this era of history to my students. And whenever I do, they always say this 5-year period, which we call the pre-code era, is like the rebellious teenage phase. And it's true. This is where a lot of the filmmakers in Hollywood saw the writing on the wall. They knew that they couldn't make as salacious films as they had been used to in the 20s and 30s. And so the pre-code era was the time to ramp it up. But not only to ramp it up, but this is now the time to begin coding cinema. And this is where I really begin. A lot of the filmmakers of this era were queer. Like half of Hollywood was out, half of Hollywood was in the closet. And a lot of the production code, like I said, like you can see some of it up here, had things like no homosexuality, no sexual perversions, no 5-second kissing. If there was any transgression present in the filmic text, it had to end with it being punished. And this is where we get into coding. And this is where I also started to begin to think, wait, so if things like queerness were beginning to be coded, and not only coded, but coded with shame, because these things had to be punished by the end of the film, then we can't talk about queer horror just in the sense of authorship. There begins to build this film culture where there are queer spectators, there are queer authors, there is a queer sort of sensibility being established that was established with shameness first. So when we also talk about this era, we're also talking about the rise of the horror film. The first horror films were released in the early 1930s, aka the pre-code era. And we have the classics, right? We have Frankenstein, Dracula, 1931. We have things like The Old Dark House, directed by James Whale, who is one of our tried and true queer filmmakers. And so I'm going to play this clip. It has no sound, so don't worry. This is from The Old Dark House with James Whale. And the thing is, this is a queer authored text, right? James Whale was openly gay at the time. He was very much out. But in this clip, we have Morgan the butler. And he is a mute butler in the film. And in the scene, he is escaping the confines of the kitchen because he heard that his friend Saul was just killed in a fall from a landing. And so even in films like this, again, authored by a queer author, we have the disabled other, the homoerotic other being built into the shame of this queerness. So shame surrounding queerness has been a contributing factor in the representation of queer bodies in the horror genre since its inception. As a result, dangerous appropriations and misinformed tropes of the queer body have run rampant in a genre expressive of national and generational cultural anxieties. Because here's the thing, cinema remains one of the most effective ideological tools in the world, and especially horror cinema remains particularly popular with young audiences. Thus, identifying the harm caused to marginalized communities through filmic representation or absence is paramount, particularly to the range of people who identify as queer in some form, but also for the non-queer spectators that can avoid harmful coding and learning those harmful codes overall. For many spectators, when they see a marginalized identity on screen, it is oftentimes the first time that establishes a reference. If that reference is problematically or even nefariously construed, the likelihood of violence off screen, be it physical, emotional, or verbal, increases to people that share that marginalized identity. And clearly, the shame about queerness that influences the filmmaking process has consequences not just for the filmic work, but for the ideological dispositions of the audience. Even in a film like The Old Dark House, we see the shame surrounding queerness being dragged up the stairs to behind closed doors. And so I want to expand on this by quoting from a theorist called Harry Benshoff. And he says that queerness in horror, particularly in the 20th century, has been treated as, quote, a monstrous condition. Movie monsters and homosexuals' closets uphold and reinforce culturally constructed binaries of gender and sexuality that structure Western thought. End quote. And so again, in a film like this, where there's negative coding surrounding a queer disabled monster, there is a presence of queerness, sure, but there is a presence of supporting characters who contribute little to the narrative, but a lot to the ominous tone a horror film frequently demands. While the overtness of the portrayal of homoeroticism in a film like The Old Dark House before the clampdown of the code was remarkable for its time, and I do want to pause and give that credit. You know, this was the 1930s. This was radical for its time. It did establish the code. And this trope of the mentally ill and or bodily othered queer monster would proliferate throughout the genre. And so before I get into giving more examples, I do want to begin to give you all a bit of a roadmap about what I mean when I'm talking about queer authorship, spectatorship, gaze, and sensibility. The first thing I want to clarify is authorship. When we, especially in film studies, when authorship is discussed, it leans on the idea of the auteur theory, you know, the French New Wave, the 1950s, the director is the writer of the film or writes with the camera, whatever, right? But authorship, I'm going to keep it simple here. When I'm talking about authors in this talk, I'm talking about a director or a writer of a film. I want to start off by actually using a quote from David R. Kuhn, who wrote this article called Collaborative Queer Filmmaking. And in this article, he states that authorship is, quote, the story is told not by one person, but by a team of people, an actor, a director, a writer, a cinematographer, a costume designer, and many others work to craft the details of the story and its presentation, not just to the diegetic therapist, but to viewers watching the film in a theater, on their television, or through some other means, end quote. There is a continuous process for the spectator as they recognize codes, from the genre-specific to the socially specific. Films position spectators to see through the perspective of a character meshed with the spectator's intersectional gaze. The interpolation instigated by the film fuses with the personal history and positionality of the spectator in their culture and society. So it's not just the fact that, again, we're making films in a vacuum. It's like, okay, there's this process, right? This interpolation. And this interpolation gets into the idea of the gaze. And so when it came time for me to think about what is a queer gaze, I leaned into my tried and true Bell Hooks. And Bell Hooks wrote this incredible essay called The Oppositional Gaze, which is about Black female spectatorship. And so in this essay, she writes of the oppositional gaze she developed by both not having access to the racial gaze offered to Black men or the specific power to look possessed by the white hegemony. And so in this essay, she writes, quote, "Not only would I not be hurt by the absence of a Black female presence or the insertion of violating representation, I interrogated the work, cultivated a way to look past race and gender for aspects of content, form, and language," end quote. Who can look is not made equal or even accessible to all spectators. Be it because of gender, race, or sexuality, marginalized spectators embrace a look that is very different from the heterosexual male gaze first theorized by Laura Mulvey. It is not enough to try to see within the heterosexist lens because seeing necessarily becomes something interrogative for the queer spectator, particularly non-homonormative spectators. And that's something that I actually want to really emphasize here. Thanks to incredible venues like Final Girls Film Festival that prioritizes women and non-binary filmmakers in the horror genre, we are able to see a wide range of horror films that really push where horror can go. You know, horror is considered the most transgressive genre of cinema, so it should be pushing boundaries. Yet, here's an honest reality we all need to confront, right? Whenever queer horror has been talked about or even theorized about in the last few years, when we hear of a documentary being made, the first of its kind on queer horror, the people making it seem to be of a very specific identity. And when we hear of a queer anthology that's going to cover queerness and horror, when you look at the table of contents, it seems like there's still just one very specific identity that seems to cover all of queerness. And this is why I leaned on the oppositional gaze, because to pretend like a queer gaze comes from one specific perspective and that queerness in and of itself doesn't cover this full range of identities is an insult to the queer community overall. The default heterosexist gaze antagonizes the non-normative queer spectator to the extent that violence is perpetuated on screen through the abuse, absence, or appropriation of queer bodies. Here's another quote from the Bell Hooks essay. She writes, quote, "Looking at films with an oppositional gaze, Black women were able to critically assess the cinema's construction of white womanhood as object of phallocentric gaze and choose not to identify with either the victim or the perpetrator. Black female spectators who refused to identify with white womanhood, who would not take on the phallocentric gaze of desire and possession, created a critical space where the binary opposition Mulvey posits of woman as image, man as bearer of the look was continually deconstructed," end quote. To bring this antagonism into focus is thus the work of a queer oppositional gaze. Now, before I get too far into it, I do want to give credit for those that have already tried to define a queer gaze. And there is this article written by Travell Anderson called The Queer Gaze. And in it, he states, quote, "How lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people create and view art. Moreover, it challenges binary notions of existence and storytelling employed in many male gaze versus female gaze conversations where the context is usually heterosexual," end quote. This is a good definition, but especially when we talk about the horror genre, it doesn't seem to be enough. Again, we're talking about a genre of cultural, generational, personal anxieties and of transgression. And the thing is, in horror, starting from the era of the production code of pre-code cinema, the malignant representation of queerness is so viscerally violent that it induces generational and cultural trauma that reaches across the closeted queer community in Hollywood, the horror genre, and the closets of spectators interpolated in the exploitation of their embodied response. Yet this is where we get into some radical possibilities, though. The collective experience of queer spectatorship, gazing, and authorship falls within this shared ground of the oppositional gaze, the queer gaze, and collaborative filmmaking. This is what I'm advocating for. I'm advocating for a true queering of authorship, a true queering of the horror genre, where heteronormativity and homonormativity is attacked at its base, because that is what being queer is really about. It is about breaking out of these of these cultural shackles that have been given to us in order for us to either acclimate to a certain type of acceptable queerness, or one that has just been completely looked over in the cultural production of other things claiming to be queer, right? And this is where I get into the idea of queer spectatorship and a queer sensibility, which I will be developing further throughout this talk. But before I begin to go a little too dizzy with definitions, I do want to begin to give some examples of, you know, all right, well, what are some of the queer codes? What is queer horror as we know it? And I'm glad that you asked. I think the best place to start next is with Alfred Hitchcock, right? Psycho, 1960. This also doesn't have any sound, but it's a good visual aid for what I want to talk about next. Now, Hitchcock, he loved his queers. Like, not really, but like really, right? We have Rebecca, we have the birds, like, he loved coding his stuff, but the most nefarious and the most demeaning and lasting appropriation of queer codes and the queer body is undeniably found in this film, in Psycho. Not only is there no respect given to any possible history Norman Bates might have with transgenderism or body dysmorphia, but the very fact that Norman Bates does also cross-dress is the very fact of the nucleus of his abjection. Correlating Norman's gender dysmorphia through psychoanalysis, Barbara Creed refers to Norman's desire to become the mother is motivated not by love, but by fear. He wants to become the mother in order to prevent his own castration, to castrate rather than to be castrated. Raymond Bellor substantiates this further by highlighting how Psycho, quote, contains two narratives, slipping one under the other, one into the other, that of Bates and his abusive mother, end quote. However, absent from these critical analyses of Psycho is the very absurdity of the reality implied, that gender dysmorphia emerges from strained Oedipal relationships, and that transgender bodies and minds resort to murder out of this tortured situation. Now, I know what you might be thinking, like, okay, May, it's 1960, everyone hated the queers back then, like, does this really have some sort of lasting legacy? And I'm glad you asked, because I have an example to show you. And so for this one, I will play the clip in its entirety. This is from Sleepaway Camp from 1983, written and directed by Robert Hiltzik.
Yes, I've always dreamed of a little girl just like you. I mean, we already have a boy, so another one simply would not do. Oh, no, absolutely not. A little girl would be so much nicer, don't you think so, Angela? Angela, such a lovely name. Why, I believe it means angel. Why, yes, I'm sure it does. I know you're going to like that name. Won't you, Peter?
She's a boy.
So Sleepaway Camp was released 23 years after Psycho, and it repeats this harmful coding in a heightened fetishistic manner with Angela, a teenage girl. And so, in order to further contextualize this ending, I want to read from an interview that Robert Hiltzik, writer and director of this film, gave in 2019, only a few years ago, and about 31 years after Sleepaway Camp was released. He was asked about the inspiration behind the queer twist of the film. And so he says this, quote, "The way I developed the idea was I started with a beginning and an ending. So I developed the ending almost first. The idea was have a good beginning that grabs the audience and then have a shocking ending so that when they leave the theater, they are talking about your movie. So I came up with a beginning and an ending, and then I began to fill in the middle. The ending wasn't influenced by anything in particular other than needing to come up with something with a big twist, something that was going to shock the audience so that they would keep talking about my film for years to come." In films like Sleepaway Camp and in Psycho, the transgender body is the joke, the shock, and the fetishized object for the non-queer audience. Now, here's one thing that I want to make clear in this talk pretty early on. I am not saying that non-queer authors should never write queer stories. And in fact, I can give a pretty good example of non-queer authorship gone right with queer collaboration at its forefront. And that example is from a 2019 film called Bit, written and directed by Brad Michael Elmore. This is about a transgender teenage girl that moves to a big city, and when she moves to the big city, she falls in with a lesbian vampire coven, as you do when you move to a big city.
Careful. That's the last one.
What is it?
The cure. If you take it before you feed, you'll turn back into your old self. Now would be the time for any questions.
Do you guys kill people?
Indiscriminately.
Innocent people?
I'd say it's like 80-20. You know, we try to target the trolls, the privileged, and their apathetic trust fund kids, but we're not a movement. We're a terrorist organization at best.
So you were gonna kill me?
Yes.
Why?
People you're attracted to taste better.
I don't want to kill people.
Too bad. Knock it off. The world's a meat grinder, kid. Especially if you're a woman. I don't think you need a PowerPoint presentation to know that one's true. We're politically, socially, and mythologically fucked. Our roles are secondary. Our body's suspect, alien, other. We're made to be monstrous, so let's be monsters. Let's be gods. What we offer here is not the chance to join a group, but the chance to truly be an individual. That's the pitch.
What about my family?
What about him? Izzy directs music videos and visits her brother all the time. Frog does tattoos out of her dad's shop in Eagle Rock. And Roya has a cat, Mr. Kitty. We stick together because we want to. Because it's safer. But you can do whatever you want, just don't break the rules.
All right, what are the rules?
Glad you asked. The first rule of Fight Club.
Fight Club?
Juggalos was taken. We don't actually have a name. I was trying to sound cool.
What about Bid Girls?
Nah, sounds like we're part of STEM or something.
Anyway, rule number 1. You never glamour another vampire. Okay, you never invade their mind to affect their decisions. Rule number 2. You kill what you eat. Otherwise it turns, and we're not ready for that kind of expansion yet. All potential recruits are decided by me, and me alone, but we all have veto power. Which brings me to our final and most important rule. You never, ever turn a man. It's off limits. Men can't handle power. They have it already, and look at what they've done with it.
What about me?
Never crossed my mind.
Heartwarming, I know. To say Bit is a revolutionary response to decades of transgender fetishization by non-queer cisgender authors would be assigning too much responsibility to a film Elmore intended as, quote, everyone deserves a fun, sexy genre film, end quote. However, the respect given to Laurel's freedom to be fun, to hook up without prejudice, to be desired without a caveat is the radical nuance absent from generations of transgender and queer portrayals depicted by non-queer authors. The genre codes are present here, right? We have lesbian vampires, punk goth aesthetics, a vibrant soundtrack, family drama, and buckets of blood. But the other is not the marginalized body or community. The other is the hegemony actively exercising power in reality. Cisgender straight white men are the primary targets for the gang. And interestingly enough, Brad Michael Elmore, like I said, he is a cisgendered non-queer author, yet there's a different approach approach to the look this film invites, one that explores the humanity of his characters, even to the heteronormative characters and the alliances built with queer-coded characters. The difference in this nuance not only has to do with Elmore's research, which he says that he cites transgender authors as his research basis for constructing the vampiric lore surrounding his trans lead, played by Nicole Maines. And so he lists books like Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine, Redefining Realness by Janet Mock, Becoming Nicole Maines by Amy Ellis Nutt, and She's Not There by Jennifer Finney Bolin. He also stated that once the script was completed, he passed a draft to a friend who is a transgender woman, Sabrina Saunders, who supported the script's authenticity and assured him that nothing about Laurel's portrayal was off the mark or offensive. This collaboration with queer friends and his queer cast makes all the difference in the humanity of the queer characters represented on screen. Now, I do want to begin to move along into talking about other ways that queer bodies have been appropriated throughout the queer horror subgenre, both fictionally and often with very material consequences. And so I think it would be remiss to talk about queer horror without talking about the lesbian vampire boom of the 1970s. And so this is a clip from The Velvet Vampire from 1971, written and directed by Stephanie Rothman. Doesn't have sound, so don't get worried. So what did proliferate with disturbing ease in the 1970s was the non-queer appropriation of sapphic bodies for the male gaze. Overall, the vampire has always been a symbol of repressed sexual desire and non-consensual sexual acts. Thus, connotations of sexual deviance have been embedded into the figure dating back to the 19th century literature. To be specific, the sapphic vampire of the 20th century seeks the fetishistic look of a broader audience base. Her erotic sexuality appeals to many heterosexual women and men, as well as to lesbians. On the other hand, it is difficult for the vampiric lesbian to separate herself from a pornographic context. Exploitation cinema was not commonly the breeding ground for directors who would eventually drift into the mainstream. Sure, there were less rules in this era, there were more women working in this era, but it was an exploitative era. And even though there were more women working in this scene, this did not create a big influx of women-directed or queer-directed films, or even queer gaze-friendly films. Yes, there were more queer bodies on screen, especially in horror, yet much of the appeal of exploitation films for the drive-in cinema and student audiences for whom they were primarily intended derived from the knowing way in which they played on audience expectations of narrative and genre. Queer authorship, let alone queer friendliness, was not a priority in the exploitation era, and nearly all of the films credited to the lesbian vampire boom age were directed by white, cisgender, straight men. One of the few exceptions, like The Velvet Vampire here, was arguably one of the most well-known feminist films of the time, and it follows this classic trope of the older lesbian vampire seducing the married couple to her abode. But The Velvet Vampire was interested in satirizing women's roles in society. It wasn't interested in correcting the appropriation of queerness done in the horror genre, particularly in the lesbian vampire genre. So yes, it breaks norms, but it does so not with sensitivity to queerness, but rather is a reclamation of women's agency through comic role reversals. Another thing I want to point out about the subgenre, the lesbian vampire boom, is the very name of it. Lesbian vampires. In films like Daughters of Darkness, The Hunger, Blood and Roses, Mary, Mary, Bloody Mary, and other films of the genre, there is a predatory attack on a man, connoting its own non-consensual undertones of sexual role reversals. Thus, applying a lesbian identity to a range of vampire sexualities that could be possibly more read as bisexual aids and bisexual erasure from the filmic space. This is an issue that has plagued the intersection of feminist, queer, and film theory since the influx of queer-coded cinema. And so, again, when I say that queer horror should be queer horror, it needs to be encompassing of all the queerness that belongs in that umbrella. It's not just gays and lesbians. We also need to be honest about how bisexuals are erased in the very classification of queer horror. Now, these were fictional examples, right, of queerness and horror, but there's actually a very material example I can give you from the 1980s of how queer appropriation majorly harmed a real-life queer body in the rest of his career into the 21st century. And so that example is with Mark Patton and Nightmare on Elm Street 2, from 1985, directed by Jack Shoulder and written by David Chaskin. And so this video, by the way, is called Nightmare on Elm Street 2, but only the gay parts. So enjoy this as I talk. So yes, at the end of the 1970s, there were more queer bodies in horror. We had the fall of the production code. Yes, all of these things were true. But with the 1980s came the cultural conservatism of Reagan's America. If anything, the ire treated with explicit queerness or homoeroticism would be enough to ruin careers if charges of homosexuality turned out to be true, or even if the idea that someone was gay seemed believable enough. The AIDS crisis of the 1980s no doubt fueled this demonization of homosexuality, especially in male spaces, and the influx of the slasher film would take these cultural shifts to turn them humorous, absurd, and improbable in any reality. In the 1980s, we have Sleepaway Camp. We also have Dress to Kill, directed by Brian De Palma, which did feature a transgender woman as a killer. Again, rehashing that Hitchcock code present in Psycho. But perhaps, again, the most egregious victim of this era is Mark Patton, as we see here, who plays the role of Jesse in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Written and directed by two cisgender straight white men, it was written by David Chaskin and directed by Jack Shoulder. The sequel to the breakout slasher film was one of the most anticipated releases of 1985. Mark Patton was a star on Broadway. He was doing plays with Kathy Bates, with Cher, and his agent told him, hey, go to Los Angeles. There's this new role for the sequel of A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. It's easily going to be the biggest film of the year. It's going to do wonders for your career. And so here's the thing, he got the role of Jesse, but he was casted as the final girl in the film. And the thing is, young, able-bodied men were not the stars of these highly gendered slashers. Central to the success of the slasher subgenre was the vulnerable, virginal final girl, the embodiment of passive femininity, who morphs into the savior of herself and everyone at the weapon of an anonymous madman. And we can list it off, right? Halloween has Laurie, Nightmare on Elm Street has Nancy, Friday the 13th had Ginny. Jesse was automatically charged with the femininity due to the adoption of his role, let alone in a film where the killer's weapons are his knife fingers, often circling around Jesse's face and mouth, essentially phallic imagery, or, whipping him with a towel in a bathroom. Even before the film was released, Mark Patton was disturbed by the subtext in a lot of the dialogue and mise-en-scène. And so this is a quote that from him. He says, quote, during the middle of A Nightmare on Elm Street, I began to realize that there was something fishy going on with the script, and it was really terrifying. I thought, I'm in a box here, and I don't know how to get out of it. This was my first leading role in a big Hollywood movie, and the question was, could I play a normal guy? I had the chops to be playing people on Broadway, but could I be the boy next door and be straight? End quote. Patton's homosexuality was more of an open secret than a closeted situation, although to the public he was set to rise alongside with Johnny Depp himself in Nightmare on Elm Street Allen. Still, the director and writer dismissed any homosexual reading of the film, reassuring their star of its harmlessness. 35 years on, so in 2019, Mark Patton made a documentary which you can watch called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street. And it's a documentary about his fall from grace due to the audience and critical reaction of the sequel. The sequel was a financial success, but the queer subtext of the film would out Patton, who fled the industry after review upon review speculated and confirmed his homosexuality, now tied to Patton's image. Despite the queerness in this film never being explicit, the appropriation of queerness had all along been central to the film because of the very queer body casted. Both the director and screenwriter would only admit peripherally that the AIDS crisis was on the mind during the making of the film. Furthermore, David Chaskin, the screenwriter of the film, would go so far as to say, well, the film was only gay because Mark Patton's gay. Mark Patton eventually would say, quote, when really pushed up against the wall, David would say this analogy, and I don't know whether David is gay or straight, but I will tell you this. I think a closeted gay person in a position of power power in show business is one of the most treacherous people that a gay actor can ever encounter, end quote. David Chaskin would finally admit to some homoerotic intent seeping into the film because of the AIDS crisis, yet the harm had already been done to Mark Patton's career, as well as to the idea that men could ever embody the notion of the final girl in horror cinema. Hostile but visible, queerness was yet again othered in the horror genre as acceptable to clown, but not acceptable to be. Now, I want to sort of get rid of the depressing part of this presentation and begin to move into ideas of queer authorship that I think are radical and that I think push the genre into where it can go. And so one of the first examples that I want to pull up is a French film called Knife+Heart, directed and written by Jan Gonzalez from 2017. And so I'll play this clip. There is no sound to it. I will talk over it as you all watch it. And so in 2017, Jan Gonzalez released this film, and it's set in 1979 Paris. It revolves around a lesbian producer/director of male-on-male pornography, Anne, as she grapples with the deterioration of her long-term relationship and the brutal murders of the actor she employs. The film is graphic to the extreme. In one scene, a leather black dildo with a retractable switchblade is inserted anally into a victim, and in another, a same-sex sexual assault occurs between Anne and her ex, Lois. Queer bodies are mutilated on screen without hesitation, yet the film never verges on the exploitative. The killer in the film is eventually revealed to be homosexual himself, a young man once caught in a secret affair with his best friend by his father, then castrated by his father, and then witness to the murder of his lover by arson in the family's barn. When talking about the inspiration for Knife+Heart, Gonzalez says, quote, "For this specific one, everything started with the main character. I was inspired by a real female producer of the 1970s. She was an alcoholic, super violent, and humiliated her actors. But at one point, I thought it was a bit too sordid. So I turned this character into someone more glamorous, more romantic, a woman in love. But I kept the idea of a relationship because in real life, she had a relationship with her editor, and I loved this idea of love transmitted by the images, by cinema, and contaminating the images themselves." End quote. Rather than queerness being the subversive other in the film, love and its refracting sickness is what condemns nearly all of the characters, leading into a dreamy, heaven-laden visual epilogue of the queerest utopia. Due to the extreme violence done to queer bodies in Knife+Heart, the queer gaze should be oppositional. Yet what happens instead is a reversal of the queer oppositional gaze, a morbid tenderness at the multiplicity of villainy, the confines of love in various forms, and Oedipal complexes. Stephen Shaviro, who is a film theorist, has this concept of embodied spectatorship. What you witness on screen is what you feel in your body, and it's mimicked physically and emotionally as you watch a film. For years, queer spectators witnessed the mutilation of queer-appropriated bodies on screen, affirming harmful biases of their own or triggered by trauma inflicted in these films. Embodied spectatorship has some value in this history, but queer-authored horrors like Knife+Heart proposes a subversion of the effects of embodied spectatorship. The queer author can metaphorize experiences non-queer authors have only stabbed at in attempts to fetishize the notion of queerness. Gonzalez, an openly gay man, understands his characters as humans with flaws first, not by the shock value of their identification despite disturbing imagery. The queer spectator thus does not embody their response to the film as a punishment for queerness, but rather as a response to the other nuances present in the characters. This is as best said by Gonzalez himself. He says, quote, "When I make a film, I always have the impression that there is a duel between me, a film buff, and me, the filmmaker, or between the cinephile and the filmmaker. I think that the images usually reflect my cinephile or cinematic unconscious at work, while the dialogue and the action and the plot comes from my more sensitive experience as a human being, not only as a cinephile. It's as if I'm trying to build a war that grows inspiration from all the films that I've seen in my life, which then allows the characters to resemble me and my own personal experiences of friendship, of love, and also of my fears. This is what is lost when queer authors do not have priority to write their own queer stories in the horror genre." Now, I want to move on to an example that's a bit more left field, and it comes from 2020, 2021. It premiered in Sundance 2021. did its rounds last year, and it's directed by Bill Benz. Sorry, the film's called The Nowhere Inn. It's directed by Bill Benz, but it was written and it stars Annie Clark, also known as St. Vincent, and Carrie Brownstein from Sleater-Kinney and Portlandia fame, aka two lesbian icons of their own right, and also two ex-lovers and self-proclaimed best friends now. So this film, it's hard to categorize this film, and probably the weirdest part of it is I'm about to argue it as a horror, but this is also an example of what exactly I mean when I say that it's not only about queering the stories, it's about queering the genre in and of itself. And so before I get too much into my argument for this film, I want to read you an excerpt of a quote that Annie Clark said about making this film. She says, "The Nowhere Inn is a metaphor for the purgatory limbo space that people can get to when they let ego drive completely and when they believe their own mythology to the point of desolation. And the theme song has the same logic of the film, which is episodic and a dream logic. We're here, and then we're over here, and then we go over here, and it's a twisting, a turning shape. Because all of them purport to be looking behind the scenes, and there is that, but there's also a wizard in charge, and that wizard is the artist. I didn't want to be telling the truth in something that is just as manicured as a narrative film. I thought, let's just script it, because I think we can get at these questions I want to explore in a more truthful way if we script it than if I'm just performing myself and sculpting the idea of myself. The trick with this is that I think most of the time, music documentaries are supposed to humanize the artist to the audience, but this film doesn't do that, and that's okay, because it's art. In this film, Carrie and Annie have this push and tug going, and it's fascinating to watch because you see their identities fall into each other and fall into this concept of what it even means to be yourself in the spotlight. And the fascinating part is we get the genre codes along the way. We get giallo callbacks, and also not only did they star and write in the film, they also produced and scored the film. So when we talk about authorship that doesn't have to be tied to directorship, this film is one of the best examples. But why I bring it up is when I watched this film, I was like, holy shit, someone finally made the lesbian psychosexual thriller. Like, you know, we've seen this tag put to films like 2016's The Neon Demon or 2001's Mulholland Drive, directed by David Lynch, both very pleasurable films in their own right, but again, written and directed by cisgender white authors. And when you, straight white authors, and when you watch those films, you feel the fetishistic gaze. You feel like, oh, right, they're lesbians and they're going into each other, okay. But in The Nowhere Inn, it's actually a reality that was experienced between these two authors that has been executed more successfully than I think I have ever seen in my life, probably because these two people have such an intimacy with each other. And yeah, it may not be a horror film in the sense that there's blood everywhere, but I can't tell you what seems more horrifying than trying to turn into my ex-girlfriend as we're making a film together. And so, again, this is a really great example of where I think where a true queering of the genre can go. And I say this because when this film was released, if you look up the reviews for this film, it was pretty much panned everywhere. And everyone was like, well, this film doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it a documentary? Is it a horror film? Like, I don't understand it. But when you do find people that do understand it, they're like, oh, this is for the queer spectators. This is because it doesn't need to adhere to a shape. It's not supposed to be the shape. It's that quote that Annie said of this twisting, this turning into becoming something that you're not sure if it's yourself. Is it your ex-girlfriend? Is it your best friend? Who are you in the spotlight? And I can't think of anything more radical in queerness than an example like The Nowhere Inn. So I do want to end this talk with finally talking about the queer sensibility that I was talking about. And I think no one has pretty much nailed this better, especially in the 21st century, than someone like Christopher Landon. And so for those of you that don't know Christopher Landon, he is probably one of the most popular horror auteurs right now. He did Paranormal Activity, the marked ones. He did the Happy Death Day series, and he also did this film called Freaky. Now, before I begin to discuss the queer sensibility and its radical possibilities, I want to play you this clip This is from Freaky, released in 2020. And for those of you that still haven't seen this film, what it's about this teenage girl, Millie, who switches bodies with the Blissfield Butcher, who's a serial killer in her town. And so in this scene, we have Millie's crush, and we have Millie, though in this scene, she's being played by Vince Vaughn. And so that context is important as I play you this clip.
Hey, do you mind if I come back there?
Sure.
Yeah? I'm so far away. So, about that poem.
Oh my gosh, please don't bring that up. That was a total mistake.
That was a mistake? Well, you accidentally wrote it and you were just going by my locker and you tripped and it fell in?
Yes, exactly. That's what happened.
I thought it was beautiful. The poem. Probably read it like 100 times.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, once I got over how creepy it was finding it, yeah.
Sorry.
I'm kidding. I actually kind of hoped that it was your poem.
No, you didn't.
Millie, I've liked you since day one.
You don't have to say that.
I know I don't. That's why I did. How weird is it that I kind of feel like kissing you right now?
Technically, you'd be kissing a mass murderer with yellow teeth.
You're still Millie to me.
Maybe we should wait for when my hand's not bigger than your whole
it's
face.
okay. It's whenever you want. I'm not going anywhere.
All right, so
Hey, do you mind?
queerness is not central in any of the Happy Death Day films, nor in Freaky. There are hints of queerness at times, like Freaky also has the casting of a non-binary character, even though they're not central to the plot. But again, queerness is not the center of any of these stories, yet we see these little winks pop up, like in the scene that I just showed you. The queerest moment of this film is in this very scene. And the thing is, the camera does not pull away from the same-sex kiss, something that easily would have happened in another Vince Vaughn film from 10 years ago. Here, the kiss is more of a wink, the queer cheekiness that normalizes the act and attacks heteronormativity at its base, free from tokenism and broad generalizations to which the horror genre can often resort. When asked about the process of his films, Christopher Landon says that he loves to play with expectations, subvert expectation. He loves misleading the audience and changing tone and genre and really pushing the boundaries of where horror can go. This is probably the best summation of a queer sensibility that I can give you. It's the clearest distillation of a queer sensibility in a queer author's own words. It is not the fact that queer authors should only write queer characters. Of course, if queer authors want to write queer stories, we should be able to. But queer authors want to write stories for everyone. We want to be just like any other author that has had the privilege of writing queer stories and non-queer stories in the past. The nuance lies within how queer authorship has subversion, playfulness, camp, imbued in its capacity that builds an overall queer sensibility present in work done by queer authors. This sensibility can also be applied to older films of the horror genre written or directed by queer authors that do not have queerness explicit in its filmic text. Films such as Hellraiser from 1987, The Craft from 1996, Final Destination from 2000, or pretty much James Whale's entire filmography. cinematography. The queer spectator recognizes this subversion and yet another positive affirmation of the queer gaze, able to be satisfied by the subtlety of the sensibility without fear of queer abuse, appropriation, or absence. While priority should always be given for authors to tell their own story, queerness should not be commodifiable and thereby available to the non-queer author, particularly when such representations verge on appropriation of harmful stereotypes. When non-queer authors attempt to address queerness in their horror narratives, it is essential for them to release cultural arrogance, to collaborate with queer people in order to present a true authentic queerness in the genre. Due to the accessibility of filmmaking and the rising rates of queer visibility in media and society, the proliferation of queer horror is at a height that has not been achievable in past generations. Even with the problematic nature of some of queer cinema's pioneers, the groundwork for queer sensibility, gazes, authorship, and spectatorship is built on a navigation of absence, of where identity within art could be expressed and how it gets interpolated in queers and non-queers alike. We now live in an era where Harry Benshoff's metaphorized closet becomes an unrelatable concept to present-day queers, but this dismantling of oppression can only succeed in well-researched or well-authored queer representation in horror spaces. To be queer is a point of pride from heteronormativity. To embrace queerness is even to reject notions of homonormativity fed to people willing to reproduce social relations within the heterosexual framework to gain access to a hegemony set to marginalize those who bear any difference outside of the heteronormative or the homonormative. Queerness should be as palatable to the queer and non-queer audience alike. The queer spectator deserves the right to a non-oppositional gaze, and the non-queer spectator should find relatability in queer representation regardless of their personal identification. Horror, again, is the most transgressive genre of cinema, descended from the great German expressionists who sought a subjective cinema as authors and as spectators. It has become the genre to reflect cultural anxieties specific to nation by nation, generation by generation. It is time to hold accountable the role authorship plays in reflecting these anxieties on screen in all of their nuances. It is time for queer villains with a myriad of complexities, queer protagonists who flourish outside or within binaries of queerness, and a celebration for both the queer and non-queer spectator to identify with an authentic queerness, or at times, a queer sensibility which seeks to revolutionize the forms of horror consumed in the 21st century. If horror is the battleground for these vital messages, then it should reflect not only the anxieties, but the range of differences per authorship and possess a respect to the subjects on screen and outside of the screen. A respect that does not deify queer people, but one that allows us to shock and humanize ourselves with or without fetishization. Thank you so much. Yes.
How queer would you say is the genre by now? Because horror isn't really like my field of expertise, I would say. So I would just love to hear your opinion on how much it changed and where you would situate it today.
I really love that question. Thank you for asking it. I really want to reiterate just how wonderful venues like Final Girls Film Festival are, because just in the one day of programming that we've had, I've seen some really great examples of where horror can go. But one thing that I took out of this presentation, because I didn't want it to be too academic, it's already like a bit, is there is a political economy to horror, and whenever we do talk about queer horror, and I experience this a lot with my students, because my students aren't like, trolling the underground. They're rather like, it's a public school, so it's rather mainstream. They often ask me, like, what is queer horror? Like what are these things of queer horror? And so you have to look at the mainstream, right? And the thing about the mainstream is there have been instances of queer horror, especially, in the mainstream, like film economies, like I think like Fantastic Fest and like Toronto International Film Festival, like, the mainstream. And what I see there is the repetition of homonormativity. Like, I will read interviews from queer horror directors, and oftentimes it's difficult to know where their authorship comes from, but even their answers to questions makes me question things. Like, they'll be like, oh yeah, I wrote this script and it was about a straight couple, but then I just changed it to 2 women. And that's it. And that's what I mean by repeating homonormativity, repeating heteronormativity. It's not that, oh, we're queer, we need to suddenly change this whole entire thing, rainbow flags everywhere, but it's like, if you have the experience, or if you talk to people with queer identities, it's not the same perspective. And so what I see right now, I think, when we talk about mainstream queer horror, is I see a lot of repetition of heteronormativity and a lot of repetition of homonormativity, and I see a lot of white spaces, and oftentimes I am like the only brown queer woman in a room, in a room full of queer academics, and so it's definitely getting better in visibility, but what I worry is that it's just, again, replacing the identity rather than thinking about, when we do replace the identity, what are we actually replacing? It's not the same life experience. So that's why I actually came up with this presentation. I really want to say that it's not just being like, yeah, let's make Spider-Man and make him gay. It's actually thinking through what life experience and what the different ways of looking brings to a story like that. So thank you.
Sure. I have another question. You gave now many examples, and but if you would choose one of your movies, when someone asks you, give me one movie, what shall I see, to give an example for what you now told, what would you choose? Which movie?
Knife+Heart, easily. I think Knife+Heart, Knife+Heart was my very inspiration for making this, because when I watched that movie, I mean, it's like, queer people do awful shit in that movie. Like I said, the main character literally, like, rapes her ex-girlfriend, and in that moment, and I remember when I first watched that movie, I was like, how am I supposed to feel about this? And by the end of it, I was like, oh, I mean, we're villains too. We do bad things too. And there's just such a range of, here, maybe let me unplug this. Nope. Okay. There's such a range of beauty and of villainy in that film, and I think that is just what I want to see more often. I want to see us be bad. I want to root for, I mean, yeah, I think Knife+Heart is a really, really great example, but I'm really interested in seeing non-white queer authors really take hold of the reins here, because that's something that I tried to look for examples for this presentation, and I really couldn't find it. And so that's where I hope to see more possibility now. But Knife+Heart is really a film that I think covers a wide range of what queerness can be. Yeah.
I heard Cheryl Dunye is working on the Gilda Tales or the Gilda Stories.
Yeah, that's so exciting. Yeah, and I have a friend of mine. I don't want to out her, but she's right now making really big strides in the horror community, and I think it's getting there. I think we're moving there. I think we're definitely moving there, but I think it's also at a point where, not to throw shade, but the documentary that I even shaded in here is not out yet, and I just want people to, like, have your ears out. Like, when you do hear these things, oh, this is the first queer horror documentary, or this is the first queer horror anthology, really think about where it's coming from. It may cover a wide range of identities, but being queer covers so many different things, and I really want queerness to be respected,
Last night's feature called We're All Going to the World's Fair. I'm not sure if you were here last night.
I did.
Yeah. The director is a trans woman, actually. We didn't mention that in the description or anything because it's not really part of how she chose to advertise the film in any way, but I was wondering if you, after watching it, can see a kind of queer authorship in the story.
That is like an 11th hour revelation. It's funny because when I was watching it, I was like, there is something like uncanny here. And now that you mentioned that, I can definitely see it. And actually, I get like no shade to queer stories. Obviously, I love seeing the queer on screen, but I am really interested in this idea of a queer sensibility growing, because I think what I've noticed as I speak to more queer filmmakers, and again, another reason why I don't want to out my friend is we want to write just stories, and oftentimes, you know, having the burden to represent the queer community can be a lot, and I can see why we want to write stories without sexuality explicit in it. And a film like We're Going to the World's Fair, I really loved how any reading of sexuality would have to be on the spectator itself, because it's never explicit in that film. And like I said, there's like an uncanniness to it. And now that you just told me that, I'm like, oh, okay, that's the queer sensibility. I see it there, because I think it would have been very different even if like a cisgender woman had done it. Like the threat of an anonymous man playing around with you in the cyber world might be leading to a different conclusion. But with that 11th hour revelation, I think that's I would definitely make a case for it being a queer sensibility in that one. Yeah, for sure.